A doorbell camera in a quiet Queens neighborhood catches a man dragging a large hockey duffel bag down the middle of the street at 4:30 in the morning, and a few hours later, someone walking their dog finds that same bag sitting near Forest Park, and inside is the body of a 51-year-old mother of stabbed more than 50 times and dumped just blocks from her own home. And investigators follow a trail of blood leading directly back to her own house, where her 13-year-old son had been asleep upstairs the entire time. And this is the murder of Orsolya Gaal, and it is not the stranger danger story it first appeared to be. Within a week, police go from a fabricated threat text pointing toward a vengeful stranger to a confession from someone the victim had known intimately for years. And this video walks through exactly how that happened, from the moment she walked back through her own front door to the moment her killer walked up to police himself and said he knew they were looking for him. Orsolya Gaal is 51 years old, living in a Tudor-style home on Juno Street in Forest Hills, Queens, with her husband and their 2 sons, and neighbors describe the family as ordinary and well-liked in a neighborhood widely seen as one of the safer corners of the city. And on the night of April 15th, Gaal goes out for the evening with friends attending an event at Lincoln Center before stopping afterward at a bar. Forest Hills itself is the kind of Queens neighborhood known for its quiet tree-lined streets and Tudor-style homes, a place where residents describe feeling genuinely safe enough that a mother going out for an evening with friends and returning home alone after midnight was never something anyone thought twice about before this specific night changed that sense of security for the entire community. Around 12:30 in the morning on April 16th, Gaal returns home from her night out, and within minutes of arriving, a man she knew well shows up at her house, and that man is 44-year-old David Bonola, a handyman who had been doing work at the Gaal family home on and off for roughly 2 years, and who investigators would soon learn had been carrying on a secret romantic affair with Gaal for about that same length of time. Bonola enters the home through a back door using a hidden spare key he already knew about from his years working around the property, and there is no sign of forced entry anywhere because he did not need to force his way in at all. He simply let himself in the way he had many times before. That access itself is worth sitting with because it means Bonola did not have to plan any kind of break-in or confrontation at the door. He simply walked into a home he had worked inside for 2 years using a key the family themselves had shown him where to find. And that same familiarity is exactly what made it so easy for him to be inside, waiting or arriving within minutes of Gaal returning home that night. Once inside, Bonola and Gaal begin arguing, and according to prosecutors, that argument was specifically about their relationship because the two had briefly reconciled earlier that same month, only for Gaal to end things again. And that ending is what brings Bonola to her house in the middle of the night. Investigators would later piece together that this was not the first time the relationship had ended and restarted, because the two had reportedly been involved on and off for roughly 2 years, a pattern of breaking up and reconnecting that finally reached its end that same April when Gaal decided for good that the relationship was over and chose not to continue it, despite Bonola's attempts to rekindle things earlier in the month. The argument escalates quickly and violently, and Bonola slashes Gaal's throat before stabbing her more than 50 times in the basement of her own home. And prosecutors would later say the attack happened while her 13-year-old son slept upstairs on the 3rd floor, completely unaware of what was happening just floors below him. The sheer number of wounds, more than 50 separate stab wounds, according to prosecutors, reflects an attack that went on for an extended period, rather than a single moment of impulse. And during the struggle, Bonola also injures his own hand badly enough that he later has to seek treatment for it at a hospital, a detail that would eventually help confirm his involvement once investigators started connecting the pieces together. After the killing, Bonola does something that reveals just how much he was thinking about covering his tracks, rather than panicking, because he retrieves a hockey duffel bag belonging to one of Gaal's own sons and uses it to move her body out of the house. And that same doorbell camera captures him dragging that bag down the street around 4:30 that morning, heading toward Forest Park several blocks away. Investigators would later note that dragging a bag that heavy for several full city blocks in the middle of the night is not something that happens quickly or quietly, and the trail of blood left behind along that entire route becomes one of the clearest and most direct pieces of physical evidence connecting the crime scene inside the house to the location where the body was ultimately found, near the park. Before leaving the scene, Bonola also sends a text message from Gaal's own phone, designed to throw investigators off entirely, claiming a stranger with a grudge against her husband had done this, and the message read, "Your wife sent me to jail some years ago when you were living near Austin Street in Forest Hills and warned him back, don't call the police or I will kill your family," and investigators would quickly determine the message was fabricated. That fabricated message becomes an important detail in how investigators eventually understand the level of premeditation behind the crime. Because staging a fake threat and sending it from the victim's own phone requires a level of calm, calculated thinking that stands in sharp contrast to the frenzied violence of the stabbing itself only minutes earlier. And it shows a man actively trying to construct an alternate story, even while his own hand was still bleeding from the attack. A person walking their dog near Forest Park finds the duffel bag on the morning of April 16th and calls police, and once officers open it and find Gaal's body inside the case, becomes an active homicide investigation within hours. Detectives quickly trace a trail of blood from the duffel bag's location back multiple blocks directly to the Gaal family home on Juno Street. And inside, they find the actual crime scene and Gaal's teenage son, who had been home the entire time, and who is questioned by investigators but quickly ruled out as a suspect. The scene inside the home tells investigators almost immediately that whatever happened there was personal and violent, rather than a random break-in, because there is no sign of forced entry anywhere on the property, and the basement where the attack took place shows the kind of extensive blood evidence consistent with a prolonged and brutal assault rather than a quick struggle. In the first hours after the discovery, the fabricated text message sent from Gaal's phone briefly points investigators toward the idea of a stranger with an old grudge, and that theory generates real fear across Forest Hills, a neighborhood unaccustomed to violence like this, and residents lock their doors and watch the case unfold on local news, bracing for the idea that a vengeful stranger might still be out there. That stranger theory does not last long because investigators find a digital trail connecting Bonola to Gaal almost immediately once they start looking, including years of affectionate comments he had left on her Facebook photos, some in Spanish complimenting her appearance and reminiscing about her childhood and about a trip to Guatemala. Those old Facebook comments span years rather than weeks, with one from 2019 calling her the most beautiful woman, and another more recent one commenting on her loving gaze in a selfie, and together they painted a picture for investigators of a relationship that had clearly gone well beyond an ordinary handyman and client arrangement long before anyone in Gaal's own family fully understood what was happening. Detectives also learned quickly that Bonola had worked in the Gaal home for roughly 2 years as a handyman, giving him both a legitimate reason to have been near the house and full knowledge of exactly where the spare key was hidden, and once his name surfaces, investigators begin looking for him directly. On the night of April 20th, something unusual happens because officers canvassing near the crime scene are approached by Bonola himself, who walks up to them and says plainly, "I hear you are looking for me," effectively turning himself in rather than waiting to be found. By that point, Bonola had almost certainly known investigators were closing in, given how much digital and physical evidence already connected him to Gaal, and choosing to approach police directly, rather than run or wait to be arrested, is its own small window into how he was processing what he had done in the days immediately following the killing. Bonola is taken in for questioning, and during that interview, he makes what police describe as incriminating statements, ultimately admitting to killing Gaal and moving her body, and investigators also notice a fresh cut on his hand, which he had sought treatment for at a local hospital, an injury consistent with the frenzied nature of the stabbing. He is formally arrested in the early hours of April 21st, and as he is led out of the 112th precinct in front of reporters, he curses loudly at the cameras before being taken away and charged with second-degree murder, criminal possession of a weapon, and tampering with physical evidence. Bonola is held at Rikers Island in the days following his arrest and briefly placed under suicide watch, and news of his arrest spreads quickly through Forest Hills, bringing a strange mix of relief and shock to a community that had spent nearly a week fearing an unknown, vengeful stranger, only to learn the person responsible was someone the family had personally trusted with a key to their own home. A Queens grand jury indicts Bonola on a 13-count indictment in May 2022, and Queens District Attorney Melinda Katz describes the killing publicly as heinous, stating that it left 2 teenagers without a mother and terrified an entire community. Bonola's attorney indicates early on that his client will not testify before the grand jury, and the case proceeds toward trial preparation over the following months, with prosecutors building their case around the physical evidence, the digital trail, and Bonola's own admissions made during his initial police interview. Rather than proceed to a full trial, Bonola pleads guilty on November 2, 2022, to 1 count of first-degree manslaughter. And as part of that agreement, the original murder charge is dropped, and Queens Supreme Court Justice Michael Aloise indicates he will impose a sentence of 25 years in prison, followed by 5 years of post-release supervision. On November 16, 2022, Bonola is formally sentenced to that full 25 years, and District Attorney Katz says at the sentencing that this was a brutal killing, and no amount of prison time can bring the victim back to her loved ones, adding that she hoped the sentence would let Gaal's family rest easier, knowing the person responsible had been held fully accountable. Bonola gives up his right to appeal as part of the plea, and once his sentence is complete, he will face deportation, and assuming he serves the full term, he will not be released until he is roughly 69 years old. Assistant District Attorney John Kaczynski describes the killing in court during sentencing, in blunt terms, calling it a vicious and prolonged attack against a woman in her own home, and the finality of the plea agreement means Gaal's family never has to sit through a lengthy public trial, reliving every detail of that night in front of a jury. What makes this case so unsettling for the Forest Hills community is not a mystery about who did it, because that was resolved within days. It is the fact that danger did not come from a stranger lurking outside at all. It came from a man the family had trusted enough to hand a set of keys to and let quietly into their home for 2 years. For a neighborhood that prided itself on being one of the safer corners of Queens, the case forced an uncomfortable conversation about how much trust families extend to the people who work inside their homes, and how little that trust can sometimes actually reflect about who those people really are once the door closes behind them. Orsolya Gaal was a wife and a mother of 2 who went out for one ordinary evening with friends and never made it to see another morning, and the 2 teenage sons she left behind now carry the memory of a mother taken from them by someone their own family had once considered practically part of the household. David Bonola is now serving his 25-year sentence, and once released, he faces certain deportation, ensuring he will never again set foot in the neighborhood where he once worked freely in and out of the home of the woman he ultimately killed.